Hello, hello. We're about to do a lab on neurons and the spinal cord. Neurons, spinal cord, some nerves thrown in there as well. We're going to start by looking at this microscopic image. So we got a little histology right here. What we're seeing here are three motor neurons, three multipolar motor neurons. You can totally see that. I've got one of those guys right here, one right here, and one right here. All my arrows I just put on are on the soma, and I can see there's lots of processes coming out of the soma, which is why these guys are multipolar. If it's from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, as we'll soon see, that tells me that these are motor neurons. Now, I do also see a lot of other smaller nuclei around. These are nuclei of glial cells, the supporting cells of the nervous system. Okay, let's look at some things on these neurons. I mentioned earlier, we can see the soma. The cell body of the neuron is called the soma. It is going to contain the nucleus as well as the nissal body. Remember, the nissal body is the neuron's version of the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Here we see the nucleus, and here we see a dendrite. Lots of dendrites here. Can't really tell where the axon is. I'm not seeing axon, but I can tell this is a dendrite because of the way it's branching here. Dendrites, of course, are going to receive signals from other neurons or from special sensory cells. All right, got my glial cell there. We know glial cells provide a variety of support functions for neuron, physical support, chemical support, defense, all sorts of things. And with that, we're done the histology. And we're moving on to a model of a motor neuron. So right here, we do have the soma. So I'm taking my cursor around the soma here. And this is the nucleus right here. You can see a pair of nucleoli in there. This is the nucleus of our neuron in our soma. Right down here, this is the axon hillock, the beginning of the axon and the place where an action potential is going to start. If we keep going, we got the axon. What we're seeing here, the gray is the plasma membrane of the axon, and that plasma membrane is known as the axolemma. Lemma means covering, so it's the covering of the axon. Here we have some dendrites. Got a bunch of dendrites. There are more. There are other dendrites as well. All of these grayish guys are dendrites receiving signals from other neurons or from sensory cells. I can also see some telodendria. Each of these telodendria are branches from other neurons. So I see a couple more telodendria over here as well. Well, I got 5 that I can see here in total. So 5 telodendria. And of course, at the end of each telodendrion, the expanded bell-shaped end of each telodendrion is going to be an axon terminal. So we see these axon terminals synapsing with dendrites here. They could also synapse with the soma of another neuron. And the axon terminal, of course, will have neurotransmitters inside it that are going to be released upon the dendrites or the soma of the neuron, where they can open channels, create greater potentials, all things we talked about in lecture. All right, we switched our view to another part of that neuron. This is the axon here. We got the axolemma. And what we can see now with this axon are the things covering it. For example, I can see the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath goes around the axon, physically protecting it and myelinating it, increasing the speed at which an action potential is going to travel. Of course, the myelin sheath is created by the Schwann cell, and I see my nucleus of my Schwann cell right here. The Schwann cell membrane wraps around the axon multiple times, and I see that right here with all these lines. And there, the junction between two neighboring Schwann cells, a small microscopic gap there, is called a node of Ranvier, and they are essential for the saltatory conduction that lets action potentials go fast. Here, I have the connective tissue that surrounds an axon and its Schwann cells. It's called the endoneurium. It's basically loose connective tissue, and it is going to bind one axon to another. Axons are bundled together to create nerves. The endoneurium plays a big role in doing that. And guys, with that, we're done with our neuron model. And what we are doing here is we are looking at the spinal cord. This is the spinal cord. So this is an anterior view of the spinal cord. All right, anterior view of the spinal cord. We're going to have our brain stem up here. So we got our brain stem up here. All right. We can see our vertebrae have been cut. All these reddish bone marrow bits here. We can see vertebrae that have been cut. We can see ribs as well, and ribs that have been cut also. Got some musculature that we can see as well. But this is the spinal cord. If we look at the spinal cord from the front as we're doing, we're going to see this big groove in it. This big groove in the spinal cord is the anterior median fissure. As we look at our spinal cord, as the spinal cord comes down, there are going to be two large parts to it. Two parts where it's a little bit thick. This is one of them, where that letter E is. That is called the cervical enlargement. The spinal cord is thick here because we need a lot of motor and sensory neurons to serve those upper limbs, the arms. Okay. If we jump to the bottom, where that number 12 is, we've got the lumbosacral enlargement of the spinal cord. Sometimes it's just called the lumbar enlargement. It's enlarged because of all the motor and sensory neurons feeding the lower limbs. This part of the spinal cord, where it is growing narrow, it is called the conus medullaris. Remember, the spinal cord usually ends at the end of L1, and then continuing downward from the tip of the conus medullaris is this extension of pia mater. It is this line right in the middle here, this thing right in the middle. And it's going to anchor the conus medullaris to the posterior surface of the coccyx. And it's called the filum terminale, the strand of pia mater that anchors the conus medullaris. What else can I see here? I can see all the spinal nerves that are coming down from the conus medullaris. So remember, the spinal cord ends at L1 roughly, which means that lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerves have to come down and then come out along the way. And this collection of lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves is called the cauda equina. Literally means horse's tail. Somebody thought it looked like a horse's tail. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. All right. Awesome. So we're done with that big spinal cord. Now what we're going to do is look at a cross section of the spinal cord. I'm looking at a cross section of the cervical spinal cord. I know that because I can tell this is a cervical vertebra. I see my bifid spinous process. I see my transverse foramen with blood vessels in it. But there's a lot of spinal cord stuff we can see. Let's start with the meninges. This outer meninx right here, where that red arrow is, this outer meninx is the tough, strong, thick dura mater made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, the spinal dura mater is only a single layer. Remember, the cranial dura mater was a double layer. Deep to it, this next layer in here is the arachnoid mater. So just deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. And then deep to it is a space, a cavity. This space here is called the subarachnoid space. It is going to be continuous with the fourth ventricle, and it's going to contain CSF. Okay? So it eventually connects to the fourth ventricle. Remember how the fourth ventricle had those holes in it? All right. Deep to that, on the outer surface of the cord itself, is the pia mater. Pia mater actually goes in with the fissure here and then back out. That's the anterior median fissure right there. So the pia mater follows the surface of the spinal cord. Now, while we have a fissure in the front, in the back we have a more shallow groove, which is the posterior median sulcus. We can see a lot of white matter in the spinal cord. White matter surrounds this butterfly. And in the back, the white matter is grouped into these things called posterior funiculi. Or you can call them columns instead. So this column is basically a large group of myelinated axons. Myelination is why it's white matter. And in the back, we're taking signals from the body up to the brain. So we're talking signals about touch, proprioception, in other words, limb and joint awareness, and even more. Lateral columns, lateral funiculus on the side, taking sensory signals up to the thalamus and the cerebellum, motor commands from the cortex and the brainstem. So posterior columns or funiculi in the back, lateral columns or funiculi on the side, and then of course in the front we're going to have anterior or ventral columns or funiculi. Sensory signals up to the thalamus, motor commands involved in balance and coordination. So all this white matter is taking signals ascending, that's sensory, and descending, that's motor. Okay, what else do we have? We got that anterior median fissure. Mentioned him already. And now, let's start talking about the gray matter. This butterfly of gray matter here. This is the ventral horn. So we got a ventral horn on each side. The ventral horn contains cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. Those are going to go to skeletal muscles. We're going to talk about how they get there soon enough. But the ventral horn of the spinal cord contains cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. The dorsal horn of the spinal cord, which we see here and we see here as well, is going to contain axons from sensory neurons that are coming into the spinal cord, bringing info about touch, about proprioception, and more. Now, the gray commissure connects the two halves of the spinal cord. In the center of the gray commissure, we have the spinal cord, the central canal of the spinal cord, which is going to come up and connect to the fourth ventricle. Right here we have the dorsal root. This is a big bundle of axons that is going to make its way into the dorsal horn. So the dorsal root is a collection of sensory axons going towards the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Now, if there's a dorsal root right there, we're going to expand it slightly to create the dorsal root ganglion. The thing is, you got to remember these sensory neurons, they are unipolar neurons. So let's say there's some skin. Whoops, that's an arrow. Let's say there's some skin out here. I know this is too close for skin, but whatever. Let's say there's some skin, and there's a sensory neurons axon. My line here is a sensory neurons axon going towards the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Okay? Well, that axon is going to have its cell body along the way. That little circle I drew right there would be the soma of a sensory neuron. So there would just be a whole bunch of somata in this part of the dorsal root, and that cluster is called the dorsal root ganglion. So right here is the dorsal root ganglion, the cluster, the collection of sensory neuron cell bodies, sensory neuron somata, and we've got that because these guys are unipolar neurons. All right, what else do we see? We see the ventral root. Ventral root is going to contain axons of motor neurons going on out towards the muscles. Once these two combine, the dorsal and ventral roots, once they finally join, which they've done by the time we're over here, we've got a spinal nerve. There are going to be 31 spinal nerves on each side. Every spinal nerve is going to have both sensory and motor components, which means every spinal nerve is going to be a mixed nerve. All right, cool. Switching spinal cord models. So we have two other cross-sectional views besides the one with the bones in it. Two other views. And they're pretty similar, so I'm kind of doing them at the same time here. First of all, we got our posterior median sulcus in the back. In the front, bigger groove is going to be the anterior median fissure. And I see my posterior columns or funiculi here. White matter, of course, myelinated axons. Then I got my lateral funiculi or columns, and of course next, you guessed it, are the anterior funiculi or columns. That takes care of the white matter. What about the gray matter? We have the ventral horn, which is going to contain somatic motor neuron cell bodies. Now in this model, we also see a pair of lateral horns, one on each side of each spinal cord here. The lateral horns are found in thoracic and upper lumbar cord. They're going to contain cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. So ventral had somatic, lateral has autonomic, and these autonomic motor neurons are going to send axons out that ventral root going towards effectors like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay, what else do we see? We got the dorsal horn right there, which is going to contain sensory neuron axons coming in. There's my gray commissure, which of course is going to contain in the middle of it the central canal, which we know is filled with CSF. There's my dorsal root, my bundle of sensory neuron axons that are entering the dorsal horn. If I go back a bit, on each of these models I can see a dorsal root ganglion, which is where I find the cell bodies of the dorsal root axons, because those are sensory axons, sensory neurons, and they're unipolar. There's my ventral root, my collection of motor neuron axons that are coming out of the ventral and lateral horns and going towards the effectors. There's my spinal nerve. Once the ventral and the dorsal roots have united, I have a spinal nerve. Now I do see a branch going backwards on this model called the dorsal ramus to go to the skin and muscle of the back. I see a ventral ramus to go forward to the skin and muscle of the front plus the limbs. And I see some rami communicantes. That's a white ramus communicans there. That's a gray ramus communicans there. Those guys are going to take autonomic signals towards their effectors: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay, microscopic view of the cross-sectional spinal cord. Last thing we're going to do in this lab video. Anterior median fissure in the front. Notice how we're doing the same things over and over here, just different views. Anterior funiculi or columns, lateral funiculus or column, posterior funiculus or column. There's my ventral horn, which we know is going to contain the somata of somatic motor neurons. There's my dorsal horn. It's going to contain sensory neurons coming into the spinal cord. No lateral horn on this particular view. Of course, not in the right part of the spinal cord. There's the gray commissure right there. Beautiful central canal, which will be filled with CSF. Now, what I'm doing here, forgot I had one more slide to show you. I'm zooming in on the dorsal root ganglion. And each of these guys, each of these neurons right here, each of these circles, this right here is the cell body. This is another cell body of a sensory neuron. So if we are in the dorsal root ganglion, we know the dorsal root ganglion contains sensory neuron cell bodies, and that's what we're seeing here, somata of sensory neurons. As one, I circled one right there for you in red. I see a glial cell as well, lots of glial cells all around. All right, last but not least is a dermatome map. Talked about this a little in greater detail in the lecture on spinal cord. And the spinal cord has 31 segments. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. This is telling me where the 31 spinal nerve pairs are going. Like what regions of the skin are going to get sensory information from those different spinal cord segments and nerves. I do not want you to memorize this at all. You should have a good general idea of where things are. And if I showed you this map, you should be able to read it. Like, for example, if I showed you the map of the front here, and I said that this is a map of I said somebody had no sensation right here? What spinal nerve pairs could be implicated? Well, the answer would be L2 and L3 because you just read the map. All right, guys. With that, I do believe we are utterly done. So this is a short one, which is really good. I'm cool with that. I hope you are too. Still a lot of stuff in here, but we did a lot of repetition. And of course, repetition is key to learning this stuff. So go over it a lot and a lot and a lot. And I will see you all later.